reflects the role of the CIA in counterterrorism during the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. In about 35 minutes, a review of interagency coordination efforts. Later, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright testifies before the commission. Right now, a report on efforts by the CIA to interrupt terrorist activities from 1998 through 2001. Commission staff member Christopher Kojum gives the review after opening remarks from Commission Executive Director Phillip Zelikow.
The diplomatic and military aspects of national counterterrorism policy leading to September 11th, 2001. We heard from the current and former Secretaries of State and Defense. Today we'll hear about intelligence policy and national policy coordination. Our first panel will investigate the CIA's efforts to disrupt al-Qaeda operations and bin Laden in the Afghanistan sanctuary. Shedding light on all this will be Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet. Before we hear from him, we'll begin as we did yesterday with a staff statement. These statements are informed by the work of the commissioners as well as the staff and represent the staff's best effort to reconstruct the factual record. Judgments and recommendations are for commissioners and the commission to make, which we will do during the course of our work and most importantly in our final report. Delivering the statement on the role of intelligence policy and national counterterrorism policy will be our Executive Director, Dr. Phillip Zelikow, and our Deputy Executive Director, Chris Kojum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Commission, with your help, your staff has developed initial findings to present to the public on the use of our intelligence agencies in countering terrorism. These findings may help frame some of the issues for these hearings and inform the development of your judgments and recommendations. Today, we will focus on the role of the Central Intelligence Agency as an instrument of national policy. The issues, I want to emphasize this, the issues related to the collection of intelligence, analysis and warning, and the management of the intelligence community will be taken up at the Commission's hearing next month, by the way, at which we expect to hear from DCI Tenet again. This report reflects the results of our work so far. We remain ready to revise our understanding of events as our investigation progresses. This staff statement represents the collective effort of a number of members of our staff: Alexis Albion, Michael Hurley, Dan Marcus, Lloyd Salvetti, and Steve Dunn did much of the investigative work reflected in this statement. For this area of our work, we were fortunate in being able to build upon a great deal of excellent work already done by the Congressional Joint Inquiry. The Central Intelligence Agency has cooperated fully in making available both the documents and interviews that we have needed so far on this topic. I'd now like to turn to our Deputy Executive Director and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence, Christopher Kojum.
Thank you. The CIA plays a dual role in counterterrorism. Like other members of the intelligence community, the CIA is an intelligence producer. It collects and analyzes foreign intelligence and provides this information to policymakers. When directed by the President, the CIA is also responsible for executing policy through the conduct of covert action. The Director of Central Intelligence, from whom you will hear this morning, also has dual responsibilities. He is the President's Senior Intelligence Advisor. He is also the head of an agency, the CIA, that executes policy. In speaking with the Commission, DCI Tenet was blunt. Quote, "I am not a policymaker," end of quote. He presents intelligence and offers operational judgments, but he says it is ultimately up to policymakers to decide how best to use that intelligence. Quote, "It is their job to figure out where I fit into their puzzle," end of quote, Tenet said. Both the DCI and the Deputy Director for Operations, James Pavitt, invoked lessons learned from the Iran-Contra scandal. The CIA should stay well behind the line separating policymaker from policy implementer. The CIA does not initiate operations unless it is to support a policy directive, said Tenet. For Pavitt, the lesson of Iran-Contra was, quote, "We don't do policy from out here, and you don't want us to," end of quote. Yet, as a member of the National Security Council, the DCI is one of a handful of senior officials who advises the President on national security. The DCI's operational judgments can and did influence key decisions on the U.S. government's policy toward al-Qaeda. In the case of al-Qaeda, the line between policymaker and policy implementer is hard to discern. Renditions. Under the presidential directives in the Clinton administration, Presidential Decision Directive 39 and PDD 62, the CIA had two main operational responsibilities for combating terrorism: rendition and disruption. We will first discuss the CIA's support with renditions. In other words, if a terrorist suspect is outside of the United States, the CIA helps to catch and send him to the United States or a third country. Overseas officials of CIA, the FBI, and the State Department may locate the terrorist suspect, perhaps using their own sources. If possible, they seek help from a foreign government. Though the FBI is often part of the process, the CIA is usually the main player, building and defining the relationships with the foreign government intelligence agencies and internal security services. The CIA often plays an active role, sometimes calling upon the support of other agencies for logistical or transportation assistance. Director Tenet has publicly testified that 70 terrorists were rendered and brought to justice before 9/11. These activities could only achieve so much. In countries where the CIA did not have cooperative relationships with local security services, the rendition strategy often failed. In at least two such cases, when the CIA decided to seek the assistance of the host country, the target may have been tipped off and escaped. In the case of bin Laden, the United States had no diplomatic or intelligence officers living and working in Afghanistan, nor was the Taliban regime inclined to cooperate. The CIA would have to look for other ways to bring bin Laden to justice. Disruptions. Under the relevant directive of the Clinton administration, foreign terrorists who posed a credible threat to the United States were subject to, quote, preemption and disruption, end of quote, abroad, consistent with U.S. laws. The CIA had the lead. Where terrorists could not be brought to justice in the United States or a third country, the CIA could try to disrupt their operations, attacking the cells of al-Qaeda operatives or affiliated groups. The CIA encouraged foreign intelligence services to make creative use of laws already in place to investigate, detain, and otherwise harass known or suspected terrorists. Disruptions of suspected terrorist cells thwarted numerous plots against American interests abroad, particularly during high-threat periods. After the embassy bombings of 1998, the U.S. government disrupted planned attacks against at least one American embassy in Albania. In late 1999, preceding the Millennium celebrations, the activities of 21 individuals were disrupted in 8 countries. In 2 subsequent phases of intensive threat reporting, the Ramadan period in late 2000 and the summer prior to 9/11, the CIA again went into what the DCI described as Millennium Threat Mode, engaging with foreign liaison and disrupting operations around the world. At least one planned terrorist attack in Europe may have been successfully disrupted during the summer of 2001. Renditions and disruptions continued as an important component of U.S. counterterrorism policy throughout the period leading up to 9/11. They are still widely used today. Using covert action in Afghanistan. To disrupt bin Laden himself or his base in Afghanistan, a very different strategy of disruption would have to be developed. In 1996, as an organizational experiment undertaken with seed money, the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA created a special issue station devoted exclusively to bin Laden. Bin Laden was then still in Sudan and was considered by the CIA to be a terrorist financier. The original name of the station was TFL, standing for Terrorist Financial Links. The bin Laden station was not a response to new intelligence, but reflected interest in and concern about bin Laden's connections. The CIA believed that bin Laden's move to Afghanistan in May 1996 might be a fortunate development. The CIA knew the ground in Afghanistan, as its officers had worked with indigenous tribal forces during the war against the Soviet Union. The CIA definitely had a lucky break when a former associate of bin Laden walked into a U.S. embassy abroad and provided an abundance of information about the organization. These revelations were corroborated by other intelligence. By early 1997, the UBL station knew that bin Laden was not just a financier, but an organizer of terrorist activity. It knew that al-Qaeda had a military committee planning operations against U.S. interests worldwide and was actively trying to obtain nuclear material. Although this information was disseminated in many reports, the unit's sense of alarm about bin Laden was not widely shared or understood within the intelligence and policy communities. Employees in the unit told us they felt their zeal attracted ridicule from their peers. In 1997, CIA headquarters authorized U.S. officials to begin developing a network of agents to gather intelligence inside Afghanistan about bin Laden and his organization and prepare a plan to capture him. By 1998, DCI Tenet was giving considerable personal attention to the bin Laden threat. Since its inception, the UBL station had been working on a covert action plan to capture bin Laden and bring him to justice. The plan had been elaborately developed by the spring of 1998. Its final variant in this period used Afghan tribal fighters recruited by the CIA to assault a terrorist compound where bin Laden might be found, capture him if possible, and take him to a location where he could be picked up and transported to the United States. Though the plan had dedicated proponents in the bin Laden unit and was discussed for months among top policymakers, all of the CIA's leadership and a key official in the field agreed that the odds of failure were too high. They did not recommend it for approval by the White House. After the East Africa bombings, President Clinton signed successive authorizations for the CIA to undertake offensive operations in Afghanistan against bin Laden. Each new document responded to an opportunity to use local forces from various countries against bin Laden himself and later his principal lieutenants. These were authorizations for the conduct of operations in which people on both sides could be killed. Policymakers devoted careful attention to crafting these sensitive and closely held documents. In accordance with these authorities, the CIA developed successive covert action programs using particular indigenous groups or proxies who might be able to operate in different parts of Afghanistan. These proxies would also try to provide intelligence on bin Laden and his organization with an eye to finding bin Laden and then ambushing him if the opportunity arose. The CIA's Afghan assets reported on about half a dozen occasions before 9/11 that they had considered attacking bin Laden, usually as he traveled in his convoy along the rough Afghan roads. Each time, the operation was reportedly aborted. Several times, the Afghans said that bin Laden had taken a different route than expected. On one occasion, security was said to be too tight to capture him. Another time, they heard women and children's voices from inside the convoy and abandoned the assault for fear of killing innocents in accordance with CIA guidelines. The plan. As time passed, morale in the bin Laden unit sagged. The former deputy chief told the Joint Inquiry that they felt like they were buying time, trying to stop bin Laden and disrupting al-Qaeda members until military force could be used. In June 1999, National Security Advisor Berger reported to President Clinton that covert action efforts against bin Laden had not been fruitful. In the summer of 1999, new leaders arrived at the Counterterrorism Center and the bin Laden unit. The new director of that center was Cofer Black. He and his aides worked on a new operational strategy for going after al-Qaeda. The focus was on getting better intelligence. They proposed a shift from reliance on the Afghan proxies alone to an effort to create the CIA's own sources. They called the new strategy simply the plan. The plan also proposed increasing contacts between the CIA and the Northern Alliance rebels fighting the Taliban. The Predator. The plan resulted in increased reporting on al-Qaeda. Still, going into the year 2000, the CIA had never laid American eyes on bin Laden in Afghanistan. President Clinton prodded his advisors to do better. National Security Council Counterterrorism Coordinator Richard Clark helped Assistant DCI for Collection Charles Allen and Vice Admiral Scott Fry of the Joint Staff work together on the military's ongoing efforts to develop new collection capabilities inside Afghanistan. With the NSC staff's backing, the Counterterrorism Center and the military came up with a proposal to fly an unmanned drone called the Predator over Afghanistan to survey the territory below and relay video footage. That information, the White House hoped, could either boost U.S. knowledge of al-Qaeda or be used to kill bin Laden with a cruise missile. Assistant DCI Allen said that the CIA senior management was originally reluctant to go ahead with the Predator program, adding that, quote, "It was a bloody struggle," end of quote. But the NSC staff was firm, and the CIA agreed to fly the Predator as a trial concept. Drones were flown successfully over Afghanistan 16 times in fall 2000. At least twice, the Predator saw a security detail around a tall man in a white robe whom some analysts determined was probably bin Laden. The Predator was spotted by Taliban forces. They were unable to intercept it, but the Afghan press service publicized the discovery of a strange aircraft that it speculated might be looking for bin Laden. When winter weather prevented the Predator from flying during the remainder of 2000, the Counterterrorism Center looked forward to resuming flights in 2001. The USS Cole. When the American destroyer, the USS Cole, was bombed in Yemen in October 2000, Al-Qaeda was immediately suspected of having struck again. The Counterterrorism Center developed an offensive initiative for Afghanistan, regardless of policy or financial constraints. It was called the Blue Sky Memo. In December 2000, the CIA sent this to the NSC staff. The memo recommended increased support to anti-Taliban groups and to proxies who might ambush bin Laden. The Counterterrorism Center also proposed a major effort to back Northern Alliance forces in order to stave off the Taliban army and tie down al-Qaeda fighters, thereby hindering terrorist activities elsewhere. No action was taken on these ideas in the few remaining weeks of the Clinton administration. The Blue Sky Memo itself was not apparently discussed with the incoming top Bush administration officials during the transition. The Counterterrorism Center began pressing these proposals after the new team took office. The Bush administration. The CIA briefed President-elect George W. Bush and the incoming national security officials on covert action programs in Afghanistan. Deputy DCI McLaughlin said that he walked through the elements of the al-Qaeda problem with National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, including an explanation of the special authorities signed by President Clinton. DCI Tenet and Deputy Director for Operations Pavitt gave an intelligence briefing to President-elect Bush, Vice President-elect Cheney, and Dr. Rice, which included the topic of al-Qaeda. Pavitt recalled conveying that bin Laden was one of the gravest threats to the country. President-elect Bush asked whether killing bin Laden would end the problem. Pavitt said he and the DCI answered that killing bin Laden would have an impact but not stop the threat. CIA later provided more formal assessments to the White House, reiterating that conclusion. It added that the only long-term way to deal with the threat was to end al-Qaeda's ability to use Afghanistan as a sanctuary for its operations. Arming Predator. During fall 2000, Clark and other counterterrorism officials learned of a promising and energetic Air Force effort that was already trying to arm the Predator with missiles. Clark and Assistant DCI Allen urged flying the reconnaissance version of the Predator in the spring, as soon as the weather improved, and using the armed Predator against bin Laden as soon as possible. DCI Tenet, supported by military officers and the Joint Staff, balked at this plan. They did not want to go ahead with reconnaissance flights alone and argued for waiting until the armed version was ready before flying Predator again. Given the experience in the fall of 2000, they worried that flying the reconnaissance version would forfeit the element of surprise for the armed Predator. They also feared one of these scarce aircraft might be shot down, since Taliban radar had previously tracked it, forcing it into a more vulnerable flight path. They also contended that there were not enough Predators to be able to conduct reconnaissance flights over Afghanistan and still have aircraft left over for the testing then underway in the United States to develop the armed version. Clark believed that these arguments were stalling tactics by CIA's risk-averse Directorate of Operations. He wanted the reconnaissance flights to begin on their own, both for collection and to allow for possible strikes with other military forces. He thought the reconnaissance flights could be conducted with fewer aircraft than had been used in 2000, so that testing on the armed version might continue. DCI Tenet's position prevailed. The reconnaissance flights were deferred while work continued on the armed version. The armed Predator was being readied at an accelerated pace during 2001. The Air Force officials who managed the program told us that the policy arguments, including quarrels about who would pay for the aircraft, had no effect on their timetable for operations. The timetable was instead driven by a variety of technical issues. A program that would ordinarily have taken years was, they said, finished in months. They were, quote, throwing out the books on the normal acquisition process just to press on and get it done, end of quote. In July, Deputy National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley ordered that the Armed Predator be ready by September 1st. CIA officials supported these accelerated efforts. The Air Force Program Manager told us that they were still resolving technical issues as of 9/11 and, quote, we just took what we had and deployed it, end of quote. Meanwhile, policymakers were arguing about the unprecedented step of creating a missile system for use by an agency outside of the Department of Defense. DCI Tenet was concerned. At a meeting of NSC principals on September 4th, National Security Advisor Rice summarized a consensus that the Armed Predator was not ready, but that the capability was needed. The group left open issues related to command and control. In the meantime, the Principals Committee agreed the CIA should consider going ahead with flying reconnaissance missions with the Predator. Shortly after the meeting, DCI Tenet agreed to proceed with such flights. Developing a new strategy. The new administration's policy review apparently began in March and continued throughout the spring and summer of 2001. At the end of May, National Security Advisor Rice met with DCI Tenet and their counterterrorism experts. She asked about, quote, taking the offensive, end of quote, against al-Qaeda, and asked Clark and the Counterterrorism Center Chief Cofer Black to develop a full range of options. A plan for a larger covert action effort was a major component of the new al-Qaeda strategy, codified in a draft presidential directive that was first circulated in early June. The emerging covert action plan built upon the ideas the CIA and Clark had been working on since December 2000. A notable change was that Rice and Hadley wanted to place less emphasis on the Northern Alliance and more on anti-Taliban Pashtuns. Clark was impatient to get at least some money to the Northern Alliance right away in order to keep them in the fight. Meanwhile, the intelligence community began to receive its greatest volume of threat reporting since the Millennium Plot. By late July, there were indications of multiple, possibly catastrophic, terrorist attacks being planned against American interests overseas. The Counterterrorism Center identified 30 possible overseas targets and launched disruption operations around the world. Some CIA officials expressed frustration about the pace of policymaking during the stressful summer of 2001. Although Tenet said he thought the policy machinery was working in what he called a rather orderly fashion, Deputy DCI McLaughlin told us he felt a great tension, especially in June and July 2001, between the new administration's need to understand these issues and his sense that this was a matter of great urgency. Officials, including McLaughlin, were also frustrated when some policymakers, who had not lived through such threat surges before, questioned the validity of the intelligence or wondered if it was disinformation, though they were persuaded once they probed it. Two veteran Counterterrorism Center officers who were deeply involved in bin Laden issues were so worried about an impending disaster that one of them told us that they considered resigning and going public with their concerns. DCI Tenet, who was briefing the President and his top advisors daily, told us that his sense was that officials at the White House had grasped the sense of urgency he was communicating to them. By early August, DCI Tenet said that intelligence suggested that whatever terrorist activity might have been originally planned had been delayed. At the same time, the Deputies Committee reached a consensus on a new Afghan policy, paving the way for Northern Alliance aid. NSC principals apparently endorsed the new presidential directive on al-Qaeda at their meeting on September 4th. On September 10th, Deputy National Security Advisor Hadley formally tasked DCI Tenet to draw up new draft authorities for the broad covert action program envisioned in that directive, including significant additional funding and involving Pashtun elements as well as the Northern Alliance. Events would, of course, overtake this tasking. Within days of the September 11th attacks, a new counterterrorism policy was in place. Key issue areas. The story of CIA activities before 9/11 brings up a number of key issues for considering how policymakers made use of covert capabilities for attacking bin Laden. Many CIA officers, including Deputy Director for Operations Pavitt, have criticized policymakers for not giving the CIA authorities to conduct effective operations against bin Laden. This issue manifests itself in a debate about the scope of the covert actions in Afghanistan authorized by President Clinton. NSC staff and CIA officials differ starkly here. Senior NSC staff members told us they believed the President's intent was clear. He wanted bin Laden dead. On successive occasions, President Clinton issued authorities instructing the CIA to use its proxies to capture or assault bin Laden and his lieutenants in operations in which they might be killed. The instructions, except in one defined contingency, were to capture bin Laden if possible. Senior legal advisors in the Clinton administration agreed that, under the law of armed conflict, killing a person who posed an imminent threat to the United States was an act of self-defense, not an assassination. As former National Security Advisor Berger explained, if we wanted to kill bin Laden with cruise missiles, why would we not want to kill him with covert action? Clark's recollection is the same. But if the policymakers believed their intent was clear, every CIA official interviewed on this topic by the Commission, from DCI Tenet to the official who actually briefed the agents in the field, told us they heard a different message. What the United States would let the military do is quite different, Tenet said, from the rules that govern covert action by the CIA. CIA senior managers, operators, and lawyers uniformly said that they read the relevant authorities signed by President Clinton as instructing them to try to capture bin Laden, except in the defined contingency. They believed that the only acceptable context for killing bin Laden was a credible capture operation. Quote, "We always talked about how much easier it would have been to kill him," end of quote, a former chief of the bin Laden station said. Working-level CIA officers said they were frustrated by what they saw as the policy restraints of having to instruct their assets to mount a capture operation. When Northern Alliance leader Massoud was briefed on the carefully worded instructions for him, the briefer recalls that Massoud laughed and said, quote, "You Americans are crazy. You guys never change," end of quote. To further cloud the picture, two senior CIA officers told us they would have been morally and practically opposed to getting CIA into what might look like an assassination. One of them, a former counterterrorism center chief, said that he would have refused an order to directly kill bin Laden. Where NSC staff and CIA officials agree is that no one at CIA, including Tenet and Pavitt, ever complained to the White House that the authorities were restrictive or unclear. Berger told us, quote, "If there was ever any confusion, it was never conveyed to me or the President by the DCI or anybody else," end of quote. The trouble with proxies. Senior CIA officials were cautious about engaging U.S. personnel within Afghanistan. CIA officers faced enormous dangers in Afghanistan, a large, desolate country in the midst of a civil war where there were no reliable means for either inserting or extracting personnel. They did, however, take on significant risk. CIA teams penetrated deep into Afghanistan on numerous occasions before 9/11. For example, to evaluate airfields suitable for capture operations. These were hazardous missions. Officers flew through mountainous terrain on rickety helicopters exposed to missile attack from the ground. CIA personnel continued these missions over the course of the next year, and on each occasion risked their lives. But reluctance to authorize direct action by CIA personnel against bin Laden inside the Afghanistan sanctuary led policymakers to rely on local forces, or proxies. For covert action programs, proxies meant problems. First, proxies tend to tell those who pay them what they want to hear. The CIA employs many means to test and verify the truth of the intelligence its agents provide, but these tests are not foolproof. Second, a strategy emphasizing proxies takes significant time to produce the desired results. Proxy forces invariably need training and instruction to carry out operations. Both these factors bedeviled the CIA's use of proxy forces in Afghanistan before 9/11. The most widely used forces were tribal fighters with whom CIA officers had established relations dating back over a decade to the jihad against Soviet occupation. CIA officers dealing with these tribal fighters had some confidence in their ability to target bin Laden. These agents collected valuable intelligence at great personal risk. Yet, when it came to their ability to conduct paramilitary operations, senior CIA officials had their doubts. As was mentioned earlier, senior CIA officials did not go forward with the spring 1998 plan to use Afghan forces to capture bin Laden. This was in part because they were not convinced that the Afghans could carry out the mission successfully. There is little evidence that the CIA leadership ever developed greater faith in the operational skills of these proxy forces for paramilitary action. Deputy Director for Operations Pavitt said he does not know if the attempted ambushes against bin Laden that the tribal fighters reported ever actually occurred. The CIA employed proxy forces other than the Afghan tribal groups against bin Laden, but with no more confidence in their abilities. DCI Tenet thought the most able proxies were the hardened warriors of Massoud's Northern Alliance, who had been at war with the Taliban for years. Though there was continuing disagreement within the agency about relying on the Northern Alliance, CIA leaders put more and more weight behind this option through 2000 and 2001. They were always aware that the primary objective of Massoud's forces was to defeat the Taliban, not to find bin Laden or attack al-Qaeda. By deciding to use proxies to carry out covert actions in Afghanistan before 9/11, both administrations placed the achievement of policy objectives in the hands of others.
In conclusion, before 9/11, no agency did more to attack al-Qaeda, working day and night, than did the CIA. But there were limits to what the CIA was able to achieve by disrupting terrorist activities abroad and using proxies to try to capture bin Laden and his lieutenants in Afghanistan. CIA officers were aware of these limitations. One officer recognized as early as mid-1997 that the CIA alone was not going to solve the bin Laden problem. In a memo to his supervisor, he wrote, quote, "All we're doing is holding the ring until the cavalry gets here," close quote. Deputy Director for Operations Pavitt told Commission staff that doing stuff on the margins was not the way to get this job done. If the U.S. government was serious about eliminating the al-Qaeda threat, it required robust offensive engagement across the entire U.S. government. DCI Tenet also understood the CIA's limitations. He told staff that the CIA's odds of success in Afghanistan before 9/11 were between 10 and 20%. This was not because the CIA lacked the capabilities to attack the target, he said, but because the mission was extremely challenging. Covert action was not a silver bullet, but it was important to engage proxies and to build various capabilities so that if an opportunity presented itself, the CIA could act on it. You could get really lucky on any given day, Tenet said. Indeed, serendipity had led to some of the CIA's past successes against al-Qaeda. But, absent a more dependable government strategy, CIA senior management relied on proxy forces to get lucky for over 3 years through both the late Clinton and early Bush administrations. There was growing frustration within this counterterrorist center and in the NSC staff with this lack of results. The development of the Predator and the push to aid the Northern Alliance were certainly products of this frustration. The Commission has heard numerous accounts of the tireless activity of officers within the Counter-Terrorist Center and the UBL station trying to tackle al-Qaeda before 9/11. DCI Tenet was also clearly committed to fighting the terrorist threat. But if officers at all levels questioned the effectiveness of the most active strategy the policymakers were employing to defeat the terrorist enemy, the Commission needs to ask why that strategy remained largely unchanged throughout the period leading up to 9/11.
Thank you very much.
Staff reports to the September 11th Commission continue. Next, a look at interagency coordination in counterterrorism during the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. At 12:30, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright testifies before the Commission. At 2, testimony from current Secretary of State Colin Powell. Right now, a report on efforts to coordinate the activities of the various government intelligence and law enforcement agencies in counterterrorism from 1998 through
Hearing
2001.
back to order,
The
please.
presentation will be given by Daniel Marcus, General Counsel to the September 11th Commission. This is about 35
We
minutes.
now move on to our next topic, which will focus on the strategies employed by the Clinton and Bush administrations against al-Qaeda and how each administration directed and coordinated the key instruments of national power responsible for implementing those strategies. Before hearing from our National Security Advisor, Samuel Berger, our Executive Director, Dr. Phillip Zelikow, and our General Counsel, Mr. Daniel Marcus, will present a statement from the staff.
Members of the Commission, with your help, your staff has developed initial findings to present to the public on the coordination of national policy in dealing with the danger posed by Islamic extremist terrorism before the September 11th attacks on the United States. These findings may help frame some of the issues for this hearing and inform the development of your judgments and recommendations. This report reflects the results of our work so far. We remain ready to revise our understanding of events as our work continues. This staff statement reflects the collective effort of a number of members of our staff. Warren Bass, Michael Hurley, Alexis Albion, and Dan Marcus did much of the investigative work reflected in this statement. The Executive Office of the President, Central Intelligence Agency, and other government agencies have made the material available to us for the preparation of this statement. I now turn over to Dan Marcus, General Counsel of the Commission and a former high-ranking official of the Department of Justice. Dan?
Thank you, Philip. The full staff statement is in the record and has been distributed. I'm going to skip around a little to try to save a little time here. I'm going to start on the bottom of the first page of the statement. The first World Trade Center attack spotlighted the problem of how and whether the NSC could bridge the divide between foreign policy and traditionally domestic issues such as criminal justice. That attack, handled by the FBI as a matter for domestic law enforcement, had been carried out by a mixture of American citizens, resident aliens, and foreign nationals with ties overseas. President Clinton concluded that the National Security Act of 1947 allowed the NSC to consider issues of domestic security arising from a foreign threat. The President later issued a formal directive on counterterrorism policy, Presidential Decision Directive 39, signed in June 1995. That directive characterized terrorism as a national security concern as well as a matter for law enforcement. Jumping to the next paragraph. These efforts were to be coordinated by a subordinate NSC committee called the CSG. During the Clinton administration, these initials stood for Counterterrorism and Security Group. This committee was chaired by an NSC staff member, Richard Clark. The CSG was the place where domestic security agencies such as the FBI regularly met alongside representatives from the traditional national security agencies. Since 1989, each administration has organized its top NSC advisory bodies in 3 layers. At the top is the National Security Council, the formal statutory body whose meetings are chaired by the President. Beneath it is the Principals Committee with cabinet-level representatives from the agencies. The Principals Committee is usually chaired by the National Security Advisor. The third layer is the Deputies Committee, where the deputy agency heads meet under the chairmanship of the Deputy National Security Advisor. Lower-ranking officials meet in many other working groups or coordinating committees, reporting to the deputies and through them to the principals. The CSG was one of those committees. This ordinary committee system is often adjusted in a crisis. Because of the sensitivity of the intelligence and military options being considered, President Clinton created a small group in which a select set of principals frequently met without aides to discuss Khobar Towers or Osama bin Laden. The participants would usually be many of the people who have appeared at these hearings yesterday and today. National Security Advisor Berger, DCI Tenet, Secretary of State Albright, Secretary of Defense Cohen, Hugh Shelton, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Deputy National Security Advisor James Steinberg, the White House Chief of Staff, John Podesta, Richard Clark, and Vice President Gore's National Security Advisor, Leon Firth. Attorney General Reno and FBI Director Free would also sometimes participate. National Security Advisor Berger told us that he designed the small group process to keep highly sensitive information closely held. There were few paper records. One trade-off of such a system was that other senior officials in agencies around the government sometimes had little knowledge about what was being decided in the small group, other than what they could obtain from the principals or from Clark. This sometimes led to misunderstandings and friction. Presidential Directive 62 and the National Coordinator. In early 1998, the Clinton administration prepared a new presidential directive on counterterrorism. Its goals were to strengthen the lead agency approach in 10 program areas, to re-emphasize the importance President Clinton attached to unconventional threats at home and abroad, and to strengthen interagency coordination. The draft directive would strengthen Clark's role by creating the position of a national coordinator for counterterrorism, who would be a full member of the Principals Committee or Deputies Committee for meetings on these topics. Skipping the next paragraph. As it evolved in the Clinton administration, the CSG effectively reported directly to principals, and with the principals often meeting only in this restricted small group. This process could be very effective in overseeing fast-developing but sensitive operations, in moving issues quickly to the highest levels, and in keeping secrets. However, since the deputies and other sub-cabinet officials were not members of the CSG, this process created a challenge for integrating counterterrorism issues into the broader agenda of these agencies and the U.S. government. Clark was a controversial figure. A career civil servant, he drew wide praise as someone who called early and consistent attention to the seriousness of the terrorism danger. A skilled operator of the levers of government, he energetically worked the system to address vulnerabilities and combat terrorists. Some colleagues have described his working style as abrasive, and some officials told us that Clark sometimes misled them about presidential decisions or interfered in their chain of command. National Security Advisor Berger told us that several of his colleagues had wanted Clark fired. But Berger's net assessment was that Clark fulfilled an important role in pushing the interagency process to fight bin Laden. As Berger put it, quote, "I wanted a pile driver," close quote. Skip the next paragraph. Changing strategy about bin Laden and his network. President Clinton often discussed terrorism publicly as the dark side of globalization. He was particularly and vocally concerned about the danger of terrorists acquiring weapons of mass destruction, especially biological weapons. He tended to receive his intelligence in written briefings rather than personally from the DCI, and he frequently would pass back questions to follow up on items related to bin Laden or other terrorist threats. National Security Advisor Berger and others told us that the East Africa embassy bombings of August 1998 were a watershed event in the level of attention given to the bin Laden threat. Skip to the next paragraph. After the August 1998 military strikes against Afghanistan and Sudan, Clark turned his attention to a government-wide strategy for destroying the bin Laden threat. His proposed strategy was called Political Military Plan Delenda, circulated among CSG and small group participants in late August and September 1998. As mentioned yesterday, the term Delenda is from the Latin to destroy, evoking the famous Roman vow to erase its rival Carthage. The plan's goal was to immediately eliminate any significant threat to Americans from the Osama bin Laden network, to prevent further attacks, and to prevent the group from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. This strategy sought to combine four main approaches: diplomacy, covert action, financial measures, and military action. The strategy was not formally adopted, and cabinet-level participants in the small group have little or no recollection of it, at least as a formal policy document. The principals decided against the rolling military campaign described in the plan, but Clark continued to use the other components of the Delenda plan to guide his efforts. Skip the next little paragraph. In June 1999, National Security Advisor Berger and Richard Clark summarized for President Clinton what had been accomplished to date against bin Laden. An active program to disrupt al-Qaeda cells around the world was underway and was recording some success. The efforts to track bin Laden's finances with help from Saudi Arabia and the UAE had not yet been successful. The U.S. government was pressing Pakistan and the Emirates to cut off support for the Taliban. Covert action efforts in Afghanistan had not borne fruit. Proposals to intervene against the Taliban by helping the Northern Alliance had been deferred. The intelligence needed for missile attacks to kill bin Laden was too thin, and this situation was not likely to change. Berger and Clark said it was a virtual certainty that there would be more attacks on American facilities. They were worried about bin Laden's possible acquisition of weapons of mass destruction, a subject on which they had recently received from some fragmentary but disturbing intelligence. The quality of that intelligence was unlikely to improve, his advisors reported. Given this overall picture, they returned to the idea they had discussed in the fall of 1998 of a preemptive strike on terrorist camps such as the one reportedly involved in WMD work. Alternatively, they wrote, the government could retaliate after the next attack, but the camps might then be emptied. The small group met to consider some of these ideas on June 24, 1999. From some notes, it appears that the group discussed military strikes against al-Qaeda infrastructure, but rejected this approach for reasons including the relatively slight impact of strikes balanced against the potentially counterproductive results. The NSC staff kept looking for new options or ideas. Later in 1999, for example, the new leadership team at the CIA's Counterterrorist Center produced a plan for increased intelligence collection and relationships with other potential partners for clandestine or covert action against bin Laden. Berger and Clark made sure that these efforts received both attention and authorization to proceed. The Millennium Alerts. As 1999 drew to a close, Jordanian intelligence discovered an al-Qaeda-connected plot to attack tourists gathered in Jordan for Millennium events. Intelligence revealed links to suspected terrorists who might be in the United States. Meanwhile, a customs agent caught Ahmed Rassam, an Algerian jihadist, trying to cross with explosives from Canada into the United States. Both staff and principals at the NSC were seized with this threat. The CSG met constantly, frequently getting the assistance of principals to spur particular actions. These actions included pressuring Pakistan to turn over particular suspects and issuing an extraordinary number of domestic surveillance warrants for investigations in the United States. Berger said that the principals convened on a nearly daily basis in the White House Situation Room for almost a month. The principals communicated their own sense of urgency throughout their agencies. By all accounts, the Millennium period was also a high point in the troubled relationship between the White House and the FBI. Before 9/11, the FBI did not ordinarily produce intelligence reports. Records of the FBI's intelligence work usually consisted only of reports of interviews with witnesses or memoranda requesting initiation or expansion of an investigation. The senior FBI headquarters official for counterterrorism, Dale Watson, was a member of the CSG, and Clark had good relations with him and with FBI agents handling al-Qaeda-related investigations. But the NSC staff told us that the FBI rarely shared information about its domestic investigations. The Millennium Alert period was an exception. After the Millennium Surge subsided, Berger and his deputy, James Steinberg, complained that despite regular meetings with Attorney General Reno and FBI Director Free, the FBI withheld terrorism data on grounds that it was inappropriate to share information relating to pending investigations being presented to a grand jury. In a January 2000 note to Berger, Clark reported that the CSG drew two main conclusions from the Millennium Crisis. First, it concluded that U.S.-led disruption efforts, quote, have not put too much of a dent, close quote, into bin Laden's network abroad. Second, it feared that sleeper cells or other links to foreign terrorist groups had taken root in the United States. Berger then led a formal Millennium After Action review of next steps, culminating in a meeting of the full Principals Committee on March 10th. The Principals Committee endorsed a four-part agenda to strengthen the U.S. government's counterterrorism efforts. First, increase disruption efforts. Second, strengthen enforcement of laws restricting the activity of foreign terrorist organizations in the United States. Three, do a better job of preventing foreign terrorists from entering the United States. Fourth, improve the security of the U.S.-Canadian border. We'll skip to coordinating a counterterrorism budget lower down on page 6. Overall, U.S. government spending connected to counterterrorism grew rapidly during the late 1990s. Congress appropriated billions of additional dollars in supplemental appropriations for improvements like building more secure embassies, managing the consequences of a WMD attack, and protecting military forces. Clark and others remained frustrated, however, at the CIA's spending on counterterrorism. They complained that baseline spending at headquarters on bin Laden efforts or on operational efforts overseas remained nearly level. The CIA funded an expanded level of activity on a temporary basis with supplemental appropriations, but baseline spending, baseline spending requests and thus core staffing remained flat. The CIA, on the other hand, told us that Clark kept promising more budget support, but could never deliver it. The Clinton administration began proposing significant increases in the overall national intelligence budget in January 2000 for fiscal year 2001. Until that time, at least, CIA officials have told us that their main effort had been to rebuild the agency's operating capabilities after what they said had been years of cuts and retrenchment. They believe counterterrorism efforts were relatively well off compared with needs elsewhere. I'm now going to skip to the paragraph in the middle of the page, page 7, on August 1st, 2000. Clark outlined for Berger a few key goals he hoped the administration could accomplish before it left office: to significantly erode al-Qaeda's leadership and infrastructure, to gain the still pending supplemental appropriations for the counterterrorism effort, and to advance the Predator program. In August, Clark urged that the CSG and Principals Committee be ready for emergency meetings to decide whether to fire cruise missiles if bin Laden were spotted by the Predator. Berger noted to Clark, though, that before considering any action, he would need more than a verified location. He would also need data on a pattern of movements to provide some assurance that bin Laden would stay where he'd been sighted. In September, Clark wrote that the drones, the Predators, were providing truly astonishing imagery, including, quote, a very high probability, close quote, of a bin Laden sighting. Clark was also more upbeat about progress with disruptions of al-Qaeda cells elsewhere. Berger wrote back praising Clark's and the CSG's performance while observing that this was no time for complacency. Quote from Berger, unfortunately, the light at the end of the tunnel is another tunnel, close quote. The attack on the USS Cole. The Cole was attacked on October 12th in Yemen. By November 11th, Berger and Clark reported to the President that while the investigation was continuing, it was becoming increasingly clear that al-Qaeda planned and directed the bombing. In an update 2 weeks later, the President was informed that FBI and CIA investigations had not reached a formal conclusion, but Berger and Clark expected that the investigations would soon conclude that the attack had been carried out by a large cell headed by members of al-Qaeda, and that most of those involved had been trained at bin Laden-operated camps in Afghanistan. So far, bin Laden had not been tied personally to the attacks, but there were reasons to suspect that he was involved. In discussing possible responses, Berger stated to the president that inherent in them was the, quote, unproven assumption, close quote, that al-Qaeda was responsible for the attack. Berger told us that he wanted a more definitive judgment from the DCI before using force. By December 21, the CIA's preliminary judgment for principles was that while al-Qaeda appeared to have supported the attack, the agency still had no definitive answer on the, quote, crucial question, close quote, of outside direction of the attack. Clark added to us that while both the State Department and the Pentagon had reservations about retaliation, the issue never came to a head because the FBI and the CIA had not provided that definitive conclusion about responsibility. The Cole attack prompted renewed consideration of what could be done. Clark told us that Berger upbraided DCI Tenet so sharply after the Cole attack, repeatedly demanding to know why the United States had to put up with such attacks, that it led Tenet to walk out of a Principals Committee meeting. As we mentioned in our staff statement yesterday, Berger obtained a fresh briefing on military options from General Shelton. In December 2000, the CIA developed initiatives, moving off the Cole now, based on the assumption that policy and money were no longer constraints. The result was the Blue Sky Memo, the so-called Blue Sky Memo, which we discussed earlier today. This was forwarded to the NSC staff. As the Clinton administration drew to a close, the NSC counterterrorism staff developed another strategy paper, the first such comprehensive effort since the Delenda Plan of 1998. The resulting paper, titled A Strategy for Eliminating the Threat from the Jihadist Networks of al-Qaeda, Status and Prospects, reviewed the threat, the record to date, incorporated the CIA's new ideas from the Blue Sky Memo, and posed several near-term policy choices. The goal was to roll back al-Qaeda over a period of 3 to 5 years, reducing it eventually to a rump group like others formerly feared but now largely defunct terrorist organizations in the 1980s. Quote, continued anti-al-Qaeda operations at the current level will prevent some attacks, but will not seriously attrit their ability to plan and conduct attacks, Clark and his staff wrote. Now we'll turn to the Bush administration. The Bush administration decided to retain Clark and his core counterterrorism staff. National Security Advisor Rice knew Clark from prior government service. She was aware he was controversial, but she and Hadley thought they needed an experienced crisis manager in place during the first part of the administration. Working with Clark, Rice and her deputy, Stephen Hadley, concentrated Clark's responsibilities on terrorism issues and planned to spin off some of his office's responsibilities for cybersecurity, international crime, and consequence management to other parts of the NSC staff. Clark, in particular, wished to elevate the attention being given to cybersecurity. On May 8th, President Bush asked Vice President Cheney to chair an effort, a related effort, looking at preparations for managing a WMD attack and problems of national preparedness. That effort was just getting underway when the 9/11 attack occurred. Rice and Hadley decided that Clark's CSG should report to the Deputies Committee, chaired by Hadley, rather than bringing its issues directly to principals. Clark would still attend Principals Committee meetings on terrorism, but without the central role that he had played in the Clinton-era small group. Hadley told us that subordinating the CSG to the deputies would help resolve counterterrorism issues in a broader context. Clark protested the change, arguing that it would slow decision-making. He told us that he considered this move a demotion to being a staffer rather than being a de facto principal on terrorism. On operational matters, however, Clark could and did go directly to Rice. Clark and his staff said that the new team, having been out of government for at least 8 years, had a learning curve to understand al-Qaeda and the new transnational terrorist threat. During the transition, Clark briefed Secretary of State-designate Powell, Rice, and Hadley on al-Qaeda issues, including a mention of sleeper cells in many countries, including the United States. Clark gave a similar briefing to Vice President Cheney in the early days of the administration. Berger said he told Rice during the transition that she would spend more time on terrorism and al-Qaeda than on any other issue. Although Clark briefed President Bush on cybersecurity issues before September 11th, Clark never briefed or met with President Bush on counterterrorism, which was a significant contrast from the relationship he had enjoyed with President Clinton. Rice pointed out to us that President Bush received his counterterrorism briefings directly from Director Tenet, who began personally providing intelligence updates at the White House each morning. Asked by Hadley to offer major initiatives, on January 25, 2001, Clark forwarded his December 2000 strategy paper and a copy of his 1998 Delenda Plan to the new National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. Clark laid out a proposed agenda for urgent action by the new administration. The approval of covert assistance to the Northern Alliance, significantly increased funding, choosing a standard of evidence for attributing responsibility for the Cole and deciding on a response, going forward with new Predator missions in the spring, and preparation of an armed version, and more work on terrorist fundraising. Clark, I will try to wind up quickly because we're running late. Clark asked on several occasions for early principals meetings on these issues and was frustrated that no early meeting was scheduled. No principals committee meetings on al-Qaeda were held until September 4th, 2001. Rice and Hadley said this was because the Deputies Committee needed to work through many issues relating to the new policy on al-Qaeda. The Principals Committee did meet frequently before September 11th on other subjects, Rice told us, including Russia, the Persian Gulf, and the Middle East peace process. Rice and Hadley told us that although the Clinton administration had worked very hard on the al-Qaeda program, its policies on al-Qaeda, quote, had run out of gas. And they therefore set about developing a new presidential directive and a new comprehensive policy on terrorism. I'm going to skip now so that we can catch up on time to the bottom of page 10. As spring turned, the last full paragraph. As spring turned to summer, Clark was impatient for decisions on aid to the Northern Alliance and on the Predator program, issues managed by Hadley and the Deputies Committee. Clark and others perceived the process as slow, and Clark argued that the policy on Afghanistan and Pakistan did not need to be settled before moving ahead against al-Qaeda. Hadley emphasized to us the time needed to get new officials confirmed and in place. He told us that they moved the process along as fast as they could, and the Deputies Committee met 7 times from April until September 10th on issues related to al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Rice recalled that in May 2001, as threats of possible terrorist attacks came up again and again in the director's morning discussions with the President, the President expressed impatience with, quote, swatting flies, and pushed his advisors to do more. And Rice and Tenet met at the end of May along with their counterterrorism advisors to discuss what Rice at the time called taking the offensive against al-Qaeda. Within the NSC staff, Clark was asked to put together a broad policy to eliminate al-Qaeda to be codified in the presidential directive. Moving to the next paragraph. Clark and his staff regarded the new approach as essentially similar to the proposal they had developed in December 2000 and put forward to the new administration in January 2001. Clark's staff produced a draft presidential directive on al-Qaeda. Hadley circulated it to his counterparts in early June as, quote, an admittedly ambitious program. The draft had the goal of eliminating the al-Qaeda network as a threat over a multi-year period. It had headings such as no sanctuaries and no financial support. Skipping to the next paragraph. From April through July, alarming threat reports were pouring in. Clark and the CSG were consumed with coordinating defensive reactions. In late June, Clark wrote Rice that the threat reporting had reached a crescendo. Next paragraph. On July 2nd, the FBI issued a national threat advisory. Rice recalls asking Clark on July 5th to bring additional law enforcement and domestic agencies into the CSG threat discussions. And that was done. Last sentence in the paragraph, on July 27th, Clark reported to Rice and Hadley that the spike intelligence indicating a near-term attack appeared to have ceased, but he urged them to keep readiness high. Intelligence indicated an attack had been postponed for a few months. In early August, the CIA prepared an article for the President's daily intelligence brief on whether or how terrorists might attack the United States. Neither the White House nor the CSG received specific, credible information about any threatened attacks in the United States. Neither Clark nor the CSG were informed, however, about the August 2001 investigations that produced the discovery of suspected al-Qaeda operatives in the United States, nor did the group learn about the arrest or FBI investigation of Zacarias Moussaoui in Minnesota. Let's skip the next paragraph. At the beginning of August, Rice and Hadley again reviewed the draft presidential directive on al-Qaeda. Rice commented it was very good and principals needed to discuss it briefly before it was submitted to President Bush. This meeting was scheduled for September 4. Skip the next paragraph. The policy streams converged at a meeting of the Principals Committee, the administration's first such meeting on al-Qaeda issues, on September 4. Before this meeting, Clark wrote to Rice summarizing many of his frustrations. He urged policymakers to imagine a day after a terrorist attack with hundreds of Americans dead at home and abroad and ask themselves what they could have done earlier. He criticized the military for what he called its unwillingness to retaliate for the Cole or to strike Afghan camps. He accused senior CIA officials of trying to block the Predator program. He warned that unless adequate funding was found for the planned effort, the directive would be a hollow shell. He feared, apparently referring to Bush's earlier comment, that Washington might be left with a modest effort to swat flies, relying on foreign governments while waiting for the big attack. Rice chaired the meeting of principals. They apparently approved the draft directive. They agreed, as discussed earlier, that the armed Predator capability was needed, leaving open issues relating to command and control of the Predator. The Director Tenet was pressed to reconsider his opposition to starting immediately with reconnaissance flights, and after the meeting, Tenet agreed to proceed with such flights. Various follow-up activities began in the following days, including discussions between Rice and Tenet, a directive on September 10 from Hadley to Tenet to develop expanded covert action authorities, and that same day, further Deputies Committee considerations of policy toward Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then came the attacks of September 11th.
Thank you all very much.
Today on C-SPAN, this week's testimony before